070, Emperor's Wrath, Bolt Gun. Please order first. Please subscribe. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Kugaza's fat head was completely devoured by the terrifying explosion of the Mtlnovel. It let out an unwilling whine from the depths of its throat full of maggots, and its soul returned to the garden. Your entire body was melted by the violent impact and flames, turning into a wisp of ash. You are dead. This simulation ends. It took 49 days. This simulation obtains the retainable option. 1. Lehman Russ Tank Driving Manual, complete, note, brake. Do you need it? I only know how to step on the accelerator. 2. Matthew's Servo Skull, relic, note, this is the only relic of the Apostle of War, please treat her well. 3. Mark IV Precision Bolter, relic, note, this is a weapon that contains the Emperor's Wrath, and it is also the Emperor's reward for you to destroy the plague. This simulation time has exceeded 24 hours, and the simulator loss is not exempted. Cooling time, 49 hours. Current available cooling time, 289 hours. Do you want to consume the cooling time? If the cooling time is not consumed, the simulator will enter natural cooling. Cooling can be waived at any time. The simulation ended quickly. The reward options were presented to Rorschach one by one. When he first saw the bolt gun in the options, an extremely bright smile climbed up the corners of Rorschach's mouth. It's finally here. Rorschach, who was in a state of excitement, seemed to have forgotten the flying vehicle he had been thinking about before. However, at this moment, Rorschach no longer had the heart to check other options. He chose the precision bolt gun without hesitation. Then, a bolt gun emitting a cold metallic luster appeared between Rorschach's hands. Even compared with Rorschach's current tall physique, the size of the bolt gun looks amazing. Hee. At this moment, Rorschach, with a smile on his face, carefully looked at the precision bolt gun that was very heavy. Even his face subconsciously revealed an obsessed smile. After he took a deep breath, he rushed out of the lounge with the grenade in both hands and headed for the shooting range in the base. Boom. With a solemn expression, Rorschach took another deep breath. He stood with his feet apart, and his soles firmly grasped the ground. Even every muscle in his body gradually tightened. The powerful recoil of the grenade can be said to be world famous, except for some grenade guns used exclusively by mortals. Most of them can only be used as daily firearms by Astartes. After Rorschach made all preparations, his finger gently pulled the trigger. Boom. In an instant, a strong impact airflow surged from the gun body of the grenade gun. It also made Rorschach take a step back. At the same time, a tall dummy made by Iron Man David with construction waste exploded instantly. A large amount of broken debris continued to scatter. Then, Rorschach, with a flushed face, could not help but let out an uncontrollable cry, even though his arms were already aching, but this pain was worth it. This is a fucking bolter --. At this moment, Rorschach, who was extremely excited, raised the bolter with both hands and laughed even more happily. Ha. However, Rorschach, who tested the power of the bolter, also paid a price. Moreover, the bolter is worthy of being the special weapon of Astartes. Just one shot, the strong recoil caused several radial bruises on one side of Rorschach's arm. It seems that I need to wear combat armor to barely use it, and I dare not turn on the burst mode, otherwise the strong recoil will definitely break my arm. Rorschach muttered to himself. At the same time, he blew a breath of air from his mouth and blew over the bruises on his arm, unless he can get power armor with force feedback. Or complete the Astartes operation. Otherwise, with the current Rorschach, he still can't use the bolter as he wants. However, Rorschach is not greedy. The bolter and the chainsword just fulfilled his little wish. Not long after, satisfied, Rorschach put the bolter in the equipment room, placed together with other equipment. Then, Rorschach turned and walked out of the base, headed home. A few minutes later, Rorschach, humming a little tune, just stepped into the house. He saw at a glance that his aunt, who had just got off work, was sitting on the sofa and talking on the phone. Rorschach, smiling, greeted his aunt. He walked quickly through the living room and returned to the bedroom. However, just when Rorschach wanted to take advantage of his good mood and find a few of the latest movies to relax, his aunt, who looked obviously depressed, knocked on the open door of the bedroom. Rorschach, lying on the bed, threw down his mobile phone. He propped himself up with his elbows. looked at his aunt and asked. "What's wrong, Aunt, did anything happen?" "Ah." Aunt shook her head slightly, sighed and said. "I just lament that things are unpredictable. I just heard the news from an acquaintance. An old friend who I have known for many years passed away due to an accident." Rorschach nodded, he comforted his aunt insincerely. "Maybe this is life. The rice you eat is not as salty as the salt I eat." "What are you talking about in life?" Aunt couldn't help but rolled her eyes at Rorschach. She was about to turn around and leave, as if he remembered something again. He quickly turned around and said. "I forgot to tell you, Big Mouth Mike's brother passed away. The funeral was postponed for more than a month. The burial date was finally determined recently. Don't go crazy anywhere tomorrow. Just go to the funeral with me." "I understand." "Oh, as you command." "Madam," after a sigh came out of Rorschach's mouth, reluctantly agreed. Then, he fell heavily on the bed. It also made the entire bed frame make a slight swaying sound. Rorschach could hear her mumbling and gradually moving away. The scattered thoughts in my mind began to rise wildly. Because the flying vehicle disappeared, the investigation into the Hongha orphanage cannot continue for the time being. Also, the cooldown time of the simulator is not long. I wonder how many guns Mrs. Gao will prepare for him, after he attends the funeral tomorrow. Do you want to go to Mrs. Gao's place first? At the same time, let's see how the gang rectification work is going. For a moment, Rorschach, who was full of thoughts, felt that his eyelids were slowly becoming heavy. He simply twisted his body. My head found the pillow and gradually fell into sleep. However, after the dark night completely enveloped the earth, the whole city became quiet. It's in the equipment room of the secret base. The bolt gun that had just been placed by Rorschach suddenly let out a low roar. At the same time, a black mist as thick as a thumb came out from the inside of the bolter. 071, a funeral. You are listening at novelfull.audio. The next morning. Google search reading that a beam of warm sunlight slowly shone on the floor of the bedroom. It also dispelled the black mist that had not yet dissipated in the air. The light seemed to pierce an invisible barrier. Waves of noisy city sounds from outside the window gradually reached Rorschach's ears. He opened his eyes dazedly. Hiss. Rorschach, who had not yet fully awakened, took a breath of cold air. He raised his palm with a frown. A few fingertips pressed hard on his temple, trying to relieve the tingling sensation coming from deep in the brain. Not long after, Rorschach, grinning, completely woke up. He slowly got up and sat cross-legged on the bed. Rorschach showed a puzzled expression on his face, muttering to himself. "Am I catching a cold? Can't I resist those common minor illnesses with my current physical condition?" Rorschach jumped off the bed with helplessness in his eyes. He walked quickly to the desk. He reached out and found a bottle of painkillers that had not expired from a pile of sundries. Rorschach didn't even need water. He just threw a few painkillers into his mouth and chewed them dry, swallowing them with great effort. After a few minutes, it seemed that the drug took effect, the tingling sensation from deep in Rorschach's brain gradually weakened, finally disappeared. "Who?" Rorschach, who had barely recovered, slowly exhaled. Even a faint smile appeared at the corner of his mouth. He stood there and moved his body. After sweating slightly on his back, Rorschach turned and walked out of the bedroom. At this moment, the gradually rising light shone through the kitchen glass onto the floor of the living room, just above the sofa in the living room. My aunt, who had changed into a black dress, was looking at the mirror. She kept combing her short hair. After she heard the sound of the door opening, she subconsciously raised her face with a moisturizing mask on. Then, the aunt with a slightly round chin stared at Luo Xia, who was standing there and twisting his neck. She couldn't help but frown. She put the mirror on her knees, shook the comb in her other hand, and raised her voice and said, "Smelly boy, what time is it? Why did you get up just now? I was going to call you. Why don't you go wash up?" Hearing the words of the aunt, Luo Xia, who was exercising, turned his head and looked at the clock hanging in the living room. He blinked his eyes and said helplessly, "Aunt, it's only 9 o'clock. It won't delay the time even if it's later." However, he heard Luo Xia's little complaint, swish. The aunt with a frown tore off the mask on her face. She raised the comb in her hand with a serious expression, pointed at Rorschach and said, "Have you forgotten the etiquette I taught you since you were a child? This is a funeral. It's the funeral of your friend Mike, the deceased brother. That the aunt, who had always been more indulgent of Rorschach's behavior, was out of character. Her tone and attitude were obviously much more serious. However, before the angry aunt started the series of mouth cannons, Rorschach, who seemed to be aching again in the depths of his brain, quickly raised the French military salute, indicated surrender. He took a deep breath and looked at his aunt with a bad expression and begged for mercy. "Aunt, I was wrong. I will go wash up immediately." So, the tall Rorschach rushed into the bathroom like a bull. 5 minutes later, Rorschach, refreshed, stood in front of his aunt in a black sports suit. The expressionless aunt threw down the comb in her hand. She squinted her eyes and looked at Rorschach up and down for a few times. The aunt couldn't help but roll her eyes. "Since you are growing so fast, I won't bother you about the etiquette of dressing. As for your taste in choosing clothes, I don't even bother to care about you. Okay, let's go." The aunt stood up from the sofa quickly. Rorschach, with a smile on his face, bent slightly. He extended his elbow to the aunt. "Dear aunt, please go first." The aunt, with a wry smile, took Rorschach's thick arm. She tilted her head. She said to Rorschach earnestly, "I warn you, be serious at the funeral and don't embarrass yourself. Do you understand?" I understand. I promise to complete the task." 2:00 in the afternoon, the public cemetery in Harlem. Mike's brother's funeral was held as scheduled. Not many people came. All of them were Mike's friends or family relatives and neighbors in the community. The tall Rorschach stood under the shade of a tree with his expressionless aunt. At this moment, Rorschach heard the heart-wrenching cry of Mike's mother. He looked at the big mouth Mike not far away, holding back his grief. He kept comforting his mother's broken emotions. Rorschach subconsciously took a deep breath. His face remained indescribably solemn from beginning to end. Just before the funeral began, Rorschach learned some news from Mike. That is, the federal government has ordered the New York Police Department, the FBI, and many other departments to hastily close the case, whether it's the dead Jerry or more mutilated missing children. All were finally defined by a cold official document. At the same time, as long as the family of the deceased receives compensation due to humanitarian donations, they automatically lose the right to continue to pursue the truth of the case. Due to the mother's mental state and tight financial pressure, Big Mouth Mac finally chose the federal government's outrageous terms. He is just an ordinary poor man whose family is ruined. Facing the federal government, there is no way to even struggle. About half an hour later, accompanied by the chanting of a black priest, everyone watching the funeral said goodbye to each other and dispersed. Rorschach and her aunt declined Mike's invitation to a family dinner. Whether it's an aunt or a Rorschach, Mike, who didn't even want to look haggard, held on. After saying goodbye to each other, silent Rorschach stared at Mike's gradually stooped back, and he hugged his mother's arm tightly and sighed slowly. "Well." At the same time, Rorschach, who squinted his eyes, subconsciously looked at the aunt beside him. He hesitated for a moment and suddenly asked, "Aunt, have you ever thought about leaving this hellish place? I mean this country?" Maybe Rorschach's question was too sudden. Auntie was slightly startled. She raised her slightly rounded chin. A pair of reddish eyes stared at Rorschach. "What are you doing? You boy feel that your wings have become stronger and you are more capable. Are you ready to abandon your aunt?" Before she finished speaking, her aunt, who was pretending to be angry, stretched out her fingers and pinched Rorschach's muscular arm. Although Rorschach felt no pain about this, but in order to avoid further irritating my aunt, he still changed the subject forcefully. "Oh, aunt, I'm just asking. To make up for my verbal mistakes, I'll treat you to a movie and a feast," Rorschach said with a playful smile. "This is what you said. Auntie didn't force you." The smiling aunt seemed to have forgotten the topic just now. She patted Rorschach's arm and said with a smile, "Come on, kid, I know where the most expensive restaurant in Harlem is." 072, Emergency, beginning. You are listening at MaleProtagonist. The sky is getting darker and night has fallen. Countless streets throughout the city are slowly illuminated by bright neon signs. On a busy street in Harlem, a French restaurant with elegant and luxurious decoration is full of people. After the diners enter the restaurant, the first thing that catches the eye is the obviously carefully designed ceiling. between a large number of expensive sculptures and statues of famous figures. One by one, the crystal-clear crystal lamps slowly hung down. It constantly exudes charming and dazzling light, and beneath the brightly lit ceiling, several waiters in black shirts shuttled back and forth among the guests like butterflies wearing flowers. Because of their stylish serving movements and handsome faces, from time to time, it arouses admiration and appreciation from male and female guests. However, right on the edge of the entire restaurant, in a secluded corner away from the bustling center, Rorschach was sitting on a chair with his hands folded on his chest, staring intently at his aunt who was lying on the dining table, devouring food. He took a deep breath with a helpless expression. Cautiously, he persuaded his aunt who was looking frightened. "Auntie, can you eat slowly? I'm not afraid that I won't be able to pay for the meal, I'm afraid that you will choke to death." The words were not spoken yet. The aunt who had been lying in front of the dining table tearing lobsters suddenly raised her slightly round chin. She tried her best to open her eyes wide and looked at Rorschach with a flushed face. It was hard to get out of the mouth full of shrimp meat. An indistinct voice came out. "Ah, this is all part of your filial piety. Aren't I afraid of wasting food?" Listening to my aunt making things up casually, Rorschach couldn't help but lean forward, his lips parted slightly. I was just about to say something to tease my aunt. At this moment, a sudden change occurred. In the blink of an eye, the ground in the entire restaurant suddenly shook violently. Boom! Accompanied by a loud roar from far to near, the lights in the entire restaurant suddenly disappeared. It also plunged everything around into darkness. Immediately afterwards, the crystal lamps hanging from the ceiling swayed and fell one after another. There was a series of shattering sounds. Before the guests inside the restaurant could react. "Ah! Run! Monster!" Above the street outside the restaurant, suddenly there was a burst of shouting. Pedestrians with panicked expressions began to run away. Countless people seemed to have encountered something beyond common sense, and they fell into uncontrollable panic. At the same time, at the moment the lights in the restaurant went out, Rorschach, with a stern expression, suddenly jumped up from his chair. The huge momentum caused the chair behind him to crash to the ground. Then, Rorschach came to her aunt's side in a few steps. He stretched out his thick arms, and the muscles wrapped under the sportswear undulated slightly. He actually picked up his aunt who was still in a dazed state. "Hey, Rorschach, you!" Before the confused aunt could finish her words, Rorschach, with indifferent eyes, carried his aunt. Standing in a dark restaurant with only dim light, I heard screams and collisions everywhere. His whole body seemed to be in a state of intense fighting. The next second, Rorschach, who squinted his eyes, ordered clearly. "David! Report the current situation and plan the nearest evacuation route." "My lord, on the street 500 meters away from you, a humanoid monster with a height of 3 meters is slaughtering wantonly and destroying public property." Rorschach finished speaking. The mechanical voice of Iron Man David sounded from the pocket of his sportswear. "In the calculation of the evacuation route, you can go through the back kitchen of the restaurant and enter the back alley of a street. There is a sewer entrance on the road a few meters away from the back door, which can be connected to a newly opened underground passage. I am currently working on it. The nearby passage is being repaired and we have quickly headed here to respond." Iron Man quickly calculated an escape route. Rorschach took a deep breath and immediately took action. He carried it on his shoulders and no longer struggled. The aunt who seemed to understand the situation, he ran towards the kitchen without hesitation. "Get out of the way! Get out of the way!" Due to the dim light inside the restaurant, Rorschach, who was running rampant along the way, knocked over several unlucky people in front of him. However, facing unknown dangers, even Rorschach had no time to worry about other people's feelings, until he and his aunt left the restaurant safely. Entering the back alley of a deserted street, nervous Rorschach, the whole person breathed a sigh of relief. Boom! At this moment, there was a huge roar accompanied by a vehicle explosion. A huge orange-red fire suddenly shot into the sky. Only a few seconds passed. The screams of countless humans kept coming from the street in front of the restaurant. Those sounds were extremely miserable, as if they had stepped into a terrifying purgatory. "Is this a war?" The aunt who was still being carried on Rorschach's shoulders, there seemed to be a little more trembling in his voice. Even the half-lobster she had been holding in her hand, he also made several rolls in mid-air and landed on the ground. "It's okay, "Ant, this is just a small scene." Rorschach felt a slight shaking on his shoulders. He quickly comforted softly. At the same time, his eyes were constantly scanning the surrounding ground, looking for the entrance to the sewer that Iron Man mentioned. Within seconds, Rorschach, carrying his ant on his shoulders, found the entrance. He came nearby in a few steps. The expressionless Rorschach put the ant on the ground first, then he bent down. A palm was inserted into the gap of the manhole cover covering the sewer entrance. Caca. There was a slight noise. The heavy manhole cover was instantly lifted by a huge force. In an instant, a sour and pungent horrible smell rose up and rushed upward. The expressionless Rorschach couldn't help but frown slightly. Just when he doubted Iron Man. "David, did you get the wrong location?" Inside the dark and deep sewer, Iron Man's mechanical voice came slowly. "My lord, I have arrived." Rorschach took out a breath and nodded slightly. He then turned around. He said to his ant, whose eyes were wide open and full of confusion, "Ant, you come first." At this moment, perhaps it was because of Rorschach's unquestionable tone, or maybe it was the influence of the human screams that kept ringing around. Even if you are facing a smelly sewer entrance, there was no hesitation on the face of the ant with a slightly round chin. She took a deep breath first. Immediately, he jumped into the blue-lit sewer without hesitation. At this moment, Rorschach stared at her ant's fallen body, after being steadily caught by Iron Man, who had been waiting for a long time. The whole person was completely relieved. He rolled his neck slightly. He took one last look at the smoke and fire rising above the street. He jumped into the sewer without looking back. 073, Blind and Clear the Way, Gauss Kills Evil. You are listening at MaleProtagonist. Rorschach's tall body flew through the air and landed heavily on the ground. Wow! The soles of his feet were immersed in the dirty water of the sewer. Rorschach straightened his back and raised his chin. Not far away, Iron Man David's eyes flashed with blue light. It also illuminates the entire internal scene of the sewer. Right between its two metal arms, the ant, who had fallen into a state of aphasia, was carefully curled up on it, her pale face full of shock. Rorschach didn't have time to explain more to her ant. He waved his palm forward and ordered in a low voice, "David, escort Ant home." "As you command, my lord, please come with me." Iron Man David turned his metal head. It first bowed slightly to Rorschach, then he nodded to his ant, who was close at hand. Then, Iron Man twisted his metal body, walking towards the dark depths of the sewer. The grim-faced Rorschach waded through the sewage. He followed Iron Man without saying a word. Tens of seconds later, the Iron Man holding his ant entered an underground passage connected to the sewer. Its deliberately chosen entrance completely blocks out the flowing sewage, however. Just as one of Rorschach's feet was pulled out of the sewage, when I stepped into the clean underground passage, rumble, there was a duller explosion. It was clearly passed through the underground structure, and slowly emitted a vibrating echo like thunder. Rorschach turned his neck and slowly moved his eyes upward without any fluctuation, even if the only thing that catches the eye is the coarse gravel at the top of the sewer. His sight also seemed to pass through the many barriers between. The ground saw that disgusting monster ravaging the city. Damn heresy! My lord, Iron Man, who had only taken a few steps, seemed to notice Rorschach's hesitation. It turned its metal head, blue light flashing in its eye sockets. Fine. After hearing Iron Man's question, Rorschach slowly withdrew his gaze. However, the palms hanging down by his sides kept clenched, even the fingertips trembled slightly. Take Ant away. I still have things to do. The next moment, the stern-faced Luo Xia suddenly twisted his neck and made a decision. He took a deep breath. The putrid and sour smell from the sewage water constantly stimulated his olfactory nerves. It also pulled at Rorschach's fiercely beating heart. I wish you good luck in martial arts. Iron Man David turned his head and walked forward without hesitation, and the ant, who was held carefully by it, pursed her lips. She clenched her fists subconsciously, but still remained silent. Soon after, the flashing blue light faded away. Wait until Iron Man's back completely disappeared into the dark underground passage. Rorschach stood there expressionlessly and opened the simulator page. He shuffled through the dazzling array of salvaged debris. Afterwards, some heavy equipment quietly appeared in the underground passage. Under night, between the streets of Harlem, thick smoke rose from buildings everywhere, and flames from burning vehicles shot into the sky, accompanied by the constant wails of the injured, and the collapse and roar of the ruins of some buildings. It's as if this part of the street has entered a deadly urban battlefield. It also seemed to have entered a terrifying purgatory. Dong dong dong. Heavy footsteps sounded slowly. A 3-meter-tall humanoid monster walked in the middle of the street. A little sweat continued to leak out from its gray-white skin, which fell to the ground. The thick bone plate that almost covered the chest opened and closed slightly with its heavy breathing. Even the ridges and protrusions on the back of the spine were glowing with a cold light. It keeps rising and falling with the walking movements of the humanoid monster. At this moment, the strolling humanoid monster suddenly raised a thick arm comparable to an adult's thigh. Immediately afterwards, a thunderous burst of air resounded all around. This comes from the great power in every gesture. It also brought out a ferocious smile on that ugly face. Hee hee. It remembers that it had a human name in the past, but now, it prefers to call itself Abomination. The hatred with a ferocious expression opened his mouth slightly. A deep voice slowly echoed around with strong oppression. Come out, Hulk. How long do you want to hide, a coward? Hateful words go unanswered. However, at this time, there was an overturned vehicle underneath. A man struggling with an injury attracts hateful attention. It swayed its huge body and took heavy steps, wandered in front of the man. The hatred that seemed to have completely lost all humanity did not even move its eyes. It merely lifts its giant paw. He didn't care at all about the man's begging for mercy and shouting, stomped on unswervingly. In an instant, the broken flesh and the metal fragments of the vehicle were intertwined and fused together, no longer distinguishable from each other. Hatred shook his gray head. A deep voice slowly sounded. You are not Hulk either, not fun. It moved its foot stained with human flesh and blood. The huge body was about to turn around. The next second, 2 red metal cans more than 1 foot long were thrown out from the ruins of the nearby building. It kept flipping and jumping in the air. The metal cans reflecting the firelight instantly attracted the eyes of the Abomination. Ding. However, accompanied by a crisp sound like metal knocking, the metal can suddenly exploded. In an instant, a dazzling white light like the sun burst out in front of the Abomination. The Abomination with its eyes wide open paid a terrible price for its arrogance. Countless blazing lights instantly blinded its eyes. The Abomination, which was completely in darkness, subconsciously raised its huge palm and tried its best to cover its eyes. It couldn't help but let out a painful howl. As the painful howl resounded around, the Abomination's huge body shook slightly, the bare soles of his feet crushed the ground, and his entire body stepped back a few steps. At this moment, a tall figure wearing dark camouflage armor suddenly jumped up from the nearby ruins. Between his hands, he also held a strange weapon that exuded a metallic luster. Transparent pipes were flowing with misty green light. In a flash of lightning, Rorschach jumped high. Without hesitation, he launched a fatal attack on the blinded Abomination. Swish! A terrifying green beam of light broke away from the muzzle of the Gauss explosion gun like lightning. In the blink of an eye, it hit the huge body of the Abomination. The gray-white skin that was enough to resist large-caliber sniper bullets evaporated almost instantly. Countless flesh and blood turned into green atoms and dissipated rapidly. Even the opponent's powerful physical recovery ability could not resist the evaporation power carried by the terrifying green light. The next second, terrifying green beams of light shot out like a storm. They were fired from the trembling muzzle of the gun. Go to hell, heretic. 074, Death of Hate. You are listening at MaleProtagonist. Every inch of the flesh and blood of the Abomination was constantly evaporating. Google search reading, even the heavy bone plates covering the chest, it could not resist the terrifying melting of the green beam. The ribs wrapped in the crystal green light quickly collapsed and dissipated, completely exposed a huge heart beating violently. At the same time, its thick thighs were also hit by green beams. The flesh and blood on it evaporated completely, and the bones melted quickly. It also made the huge body of the Abomination lose support instantly, like a rotten tree falling behind. Boom! The broken body fell to the ground with a bang. It shook up countless dust and green atoms that kept escaping. At this moment, the limbs of the Abomination had been separated from the broken body and disappeared. Only the gray head connected to part of the neck, and the huge heart exposed to the air. The beating heart can prove that it is still alive. At this moment, the Abomination, who was in endless fear and confusion, wanted to roar and question, but below the neck, the green light that continued to spread upwards also melted its vocal cords and trachea, so that the abomination could not make any other sound, only the desperate gasp of struggle. The abomination twisted its body desperately in front of the darkness. With the help of part of the skin on its back, it felt the vibration of the ground. It suddenly discovered in despair. The figure that destroyed its powerful body so easily was slowly approaching. Puff. A few seconds later, a cold and piercing metal blade suddenly pierced into the huge heart that was still beating. At this time, on the street that suddenly became quiet, Rorschach raised the Gauss explosion gun. He pulled out the bayonet that was inserted into the opponent's heart. He once again pointed the muzzle at the gradually cold huge body and pulled the trigger. Swish. A series of terrifying green lights completely submerged everything in front of him. Even the nearby ground was melted by a thick layer. In an instant, a large number of green atoms that returned to the world escaped and rose. Click. Rorschach, wearing Kashyyygian armor, suddenly stopped shooting. He raised his head wrapped in a closed helmet. He stared at the end of the street. Police cars and military Hummers arrived late. He couldn't help but snorted from inside the helmet. Humph. Then, Rorschach carried the Gauss blaster. He walked into the shadow of the building near the street without looking back. Not long after, when the sweaty policemen and fully armed soldiers carefully passed through the ruined streets and reached the target of attack, but they only saw the terrifying pits on the street ground, and a huge toe left by a humanoid monster. Everyone looked at each other in confusion. An hour later, Rorschach passed through the tortuous underground passage, back to the secret base. He saw the Iron Man David waiting for him at a glance. He glanced around a few times, but did not see his aunt. Rorschach put down the Gauss blaster in his hand. He raised his hand to take off his helmet, looked at the Iron Man and asked, "Where is your aunt?" That Iron Man David seemed to be accustomed to the equipment on Rorschach. It turned its metal head. Blue light flashed in its eye sockets. "My lord, your aunt has returned home to rest. I think she has too many things to digest today." Hearing the mechanical voice of the Iron Man, silent Rorschach took a deep breath. He walked to the round table in the hall. He threw his helmet away. Rorschach turned over and sat on the metal table. He sighed and said, "I didn't want my aunt to know too much. She is just an ordinary person with old-fashioned ideas, and she doesn't need to bear such pressure from me. My lord, please allow me to interrupt." Before he finished speaking, the Iron Man suddenly shook his tall metal body forward. Its mechanical voice seemed to contain a trace of jumping. "Your aunt is not as fragile as you think. In fact, when you were away, your aunt had quickly calmed her inner panic through her actions, and even tried to communicate with me. Although her method was a little clumsy, her respect for me far exceeded that of Ms. Jessica, or even you. Please forgive my transgression, but this is the factual logic of the data, and I don't think you need to worry about it, especially about your aunt." Iron Man's words made Rorschach fall into silence again. His drooping feet swayed back and forth unconsciously. A few minutes later, Rorschach, with a little fatigue in his eyes, jumped off the metal table. "I think I need to reflect on it." He walked towards the lounge without looking back. Half an hour later, Rorschach, who had cleaned up, quietly opened the door of his house. He stared at the dark living room. He hesitated for a moment and did not go to disturb his aunt. Rorschach went straight back to the bedroom. He lay on the bed, turned on his mobile phone and looked at the news content inside. Tonight, the appearance of a murderous monster has plunged the entire New York into panic, especially after the preliminary death toll was calculated. This further aroused the anger of many netizens. Some questioned the military and criticized the federal government. Others mocked the billionaire Iron Man for his love of rescuing foreigners. In short, the chaotic online world is full of demons. Rorschach squinted his eyes and read for a while. No more useful information found. He threw down his cell phone and planned to rest. Rorschach closed his eyes and slowly entered a hazy state of sleep. He seemed to feel an unknown place deep in his brain. Something is brewing. However, before his thoughts could escape, Rorschach caught this strange throbbing. The whole person fell into a deep sleep. The next morning, Rorschach got up and planned to have a heart-to-heart talk with her aunt. However, before he could speak, he was comforted by his aunt. The aunt first expressed her appreciation for Rorschach's coming forward last night. At the same time, I was also pleased with Rorschach's growth. Finally, my aunt's words unexpectedly revealed a meaning. that's whatever Rorschach plans to do in the future, as a family member, she will choose to support and understand, if one day, everything familiar around my aunt has undergone uncontrollable changes, then she is willing to obey Rorschach's arrangements. His aunt will not be an extra burden on him. All in all, some sincere words from my aunt. Instead, Rorschach was left speechless. He could only nod silently while thinking about his aunt's future. Soon after, because Lin Yu called to inquire, my aunt decided to go to the restaurant and open it for business. Rorschach, who stayed at home, simply ate something. I plan to review my knowledge for the exam, then go to the base to see Jessica's recovery. Half an hour later, Rorschach hesitated as if he remembered something. He reopened the emulator, going to do the next simulation. 075, Titanium King. The best way, great. 1. You are listening at NovelFull.audio. Simulation starting. Current identities: Katakan Recruit, Krieg Grenadier, Kashijan Sergeant, Latalis Stormtrooper. Please choose your identity first. If you refuse, you will be descended immediately. Identity selection has been refused. Simulation starting. You have descended into the Warhammer universe. Time, unknown. Location, Galaxy Ultrastar. Talos. You have descended into a Valkyrie transport plane. You are wearing a heavy military green carapace armor and a closed helmet on your head. You hold an Achatron laser gun in your hand and carry a gravity umbrella on your back. You turn your eyes calmly and look around. Inside the dimly lit cabin of the Valkyrie, mortal soldiers dressed the same as you are silently making preparations for the war. Most of them were cleaning Achatron laser guns, and a few carried Achatron flamethrowers and mortars. You took a deep breath and adapted to the slightly vibrating cabin environment. You were just about to ask a nearby soldier about the situation. In the Valkyrie's cockpit, a middle-aged man in the uniform of an Imperial officer staggered out. The middle-aged man's hair, which was pressed under a wide-brimmed hat, had turned gray. Most of the skin on his face seemed to have been washed by lasers, covered with rough wrinkles and scars, most of the members of the Astra Militarum. The solemn voice of the middle-aged officer slowly echoed in the cabin, attracting all the soldiers, including you. Isn't this a reminder to you big-headed soldiers? The middle-aged officer glanced around, and a smile suddenly appeared on his scarred face. They will leave on the Valkyrie transport plane, adjusting their laser guns leisurely, chanting prayers, and slowly and steadily landing on the ground under anti-aircraft fire. But you won't do that. The middle-aged officer's voice gradually increased, and his eyes seemed to be burning with fire. You will leave the Valkyrie in a completely different way. Tell me. Boys and girls, how will you land? The middle-aged officer's neck was bulging with veins, and he shouted at the top of his voice. In an instant, the mortal soldiers inside the cabin stopped any movement of their hands. They stood up in unison. A firm and powerful voice came from the closed helmet and kept echoing around. Report to the commander. We landed on our feet. You mixed in the crowd and shouted subconsciously with everyone. Hoo-ha! The middle-aged officer straightened his back, saluted everyone and let out a strange cry. Hoo-ha! The mortal soldiers around him responded proudly, at this moment, accompanied by the sound of a mechanical valve turning. The gravity parachute you carry on your back made a low hum. You looked in the direction of the sound, and the door of the Valkyrie's cabin had slowly opened, and the dazzling light illuminated the entire cabin. At the same time, a piercing cold wind rushed in, constantly hitting everyone inside the cabin. You were almost blown to the ground by the strong wind without any preparation. Be careful. Captain. The mortal soldier standing near you held your arm. A powerful female voice came from the closed helmet. You didn't have time to thank the other party. You see the mortal soldiers screaming and running towards the sky outside the cabin. When their bodies leave the cabin and jump into the air, the gravity parachute behind them will emit a dazzling white flame, helping them to quickly adjust their body posture. The big-headed woman who helps you pats your arm, and then rushes forward without hesitation. You gradually develop a fear of airborne. You hesitate for a moment. However, you turn your eyes and find the middle-aged officer slowly putting his hand on his waist. You take a deep breath. You subconsciously let out a courageous roar. You resolutely rush out of the cabin. You jump into the air. A trace of biting cold wind penetrates the gap of the carapace like a blade, and pours into your body fiercely. You fall into a short state of weightlessness. The gravity parachute on your back quickly helped you find your balance in a panic. At this moment, under the background of the azure sky, the roaring engines of the Valkyrie transport planes are constantly pouring out the mortal soldiers inside the cabin. You accidentally saw the eye-catching logo on the side of the transport plane. It also made you recognize the true origin of this team, the Alicia Airborne Corps. The cold wind consumes your body temperature. You can't help but grit your teeth. You keep scanning the soldiers around you, learning their landing postures. A minute later, your feet landed heavily on the ground, and even your military boots were inserted into the mud. You feel the pain in your legs and feet. But the firm feeling of your 2 feet stepping on the ground also gradually makes you feel relieved. I hate airdrops. You muttered to yourself. Then, fully armed mortal soldiers landed heavily around you. They quickly crouched down, guarding the surroundings, and quickly took off the gravity parachute on their backs. You took a deep breath and took off the gravity parachute clumsily. You looked down to check the equipment you carried and clenched the laser gun in your hand. You found that you landed in an industrial area with tall buildings. At this moment, some mortal soldiers who launched a raid quickly rushed into the nearby buildings. Bursts of burning lasers and the blue energy of unknown enemies kept flashing, completely igniting the flames of war. You just wanted to get up and join the battle. Captain. Wrong direction. 9 soldiers wearing carapace armor and closed helmets came to your side one after another. The familiar voice of the big-headed woman stopped your reckless behavior. Repeat the mission objective again. Your thoughts turned quickly, and you asked calmly. The mission of our 23rd Airborne Regiment is to capture the entire 23 to 30 freshwater plant, and the goal of our company is to occupy the nearby water storage tank. The big-headed woman seemed confused, but she quickly reported the current situation to you. You nodded slightly, and asked the other party to point out the direction of the attack. You and the other members of the team quickly moved towards the target location. The sound of fierce exchange of fire continued to come, and you have not yet seen the true appearance of the enemy. In an instant, a group of red drone bees suddenly rushed out from the corner of the road ahead. These strange mechanical creations fired a series of blue pulse energy at you. You quickly grabbed the female bighead's back armor and saved her life. You raised the laser gun with one hand and pulled the trigger. You launched an extremely accurate burst of fire at the drone bees flying in the air. 076, Titanium King. The best way, great. Part 2. You are listening at MaleProtagonist. Just after you quickly launched a counterattack, other members of the team also responded. The scorching beams of the laser gun continuously hit the drone bees. Almost every shot hit the target. In the blink of an eye, a group of drone bees fell to the ground, constantly stimulating the sound of sizzling electricity. At this moment, a thin figure wearing red mechanical armor suddenly appeared above the nearby building. It began to attack you from a high position. The entire team had to lie down behind a low wall and try to fight back. A dark blue pulse of energy suddenly passed through the wall and narrowly brushed past your helmet. Hell gun. Fire suppression. You subconsciously shouted to the team members behind you. Report to the captain. We don't have it. The big-headed woman replied to you while pulling the trigger of the laser gun. Then throw smoke grenades. Block the enemy's vision. You took a deep breath, held your breath and tried to snipe the Pathfinder warrior on the top of the building. Report to the captain. We didn't bring any. Another mortal soldier ducked his head to avoid a blue pulse of energy and shouted at you. Fuck. What did you bring before going to the battlefield? You tried to suppress the anger that surged in your heart and turned your head to shout. Report to the captain. Only dozens of fragmentation grenades, a grenade launcher, and a flamethrower filled with fuel. The big-headed woman lowered her head to check the equipment of the team members and quickly answered, "Fuck. When has the Astra Militarum I fought been so poor?" You gritted your teeth and glared at the enemy on the top of the building. You threw down the laser gun in your hand. You pulled 2 fragmentation grenades from your waist and pulled the buckle. You rolled over the low wall, and before the thin figure could fire again, you suddenly stood up and threw a fragmentation grenade. The fragmentation grenade you carefully calculated exploded in the air in an instant. The expanding flames obscured the enemy's vision and delayed the enemy's shooting. At the same time, the grenade launcher that was ready was raised from the big-headed woman's hand and aimed at the building where the enemy was, accompanied by a huge roar and rubble splashing everywhere. An enemy head covered in red armor passed through the air, rolled and bounced and landed near you. You walked forward and lifted the mask of the red armor. A blue-skinned alien that seemed to have no nose was exposed in front of you. Aha, it turned out to be the Tau. You muttered softly. Then, the other members of the team also gathered around. While they were alert to the movements around them, they looked at this new alien with amazement. The big-headed woman picked up the laser gun you dropped and handed it back to you. You thanked her again. You turned around and greeted the other team members, giving orders to organize their equipment and continue to move forward. On the first day, your team became the last team to reach the target location. From the front line of the fierce exchange of fire, you saw the Fire Clan warriors wearing khaki-powered exoskeleton combat suits. They are the basic infantry units in the Tau Empire. These Fire Clan warriors use a pulse rifle that is more powerful and heavier than the laser gun, shooting beams of blue pulse energy. At this moment, they are relying on the defensive capabilities of the building and the mobility advantages of the powered exoskeleton combat suits, stubbornly resisting the waves of attacks from the 4th Airborne Corps. Since the order you received was to occupy the Danshue factory, and there was also a lack of heavy weapons to support the attack, the offensive of the entire company gradually fell into a tiring stalemate. After carefully observing the situation on the battlefield, you turned around and found the company commander. You asked the company commander to allow you to form an assault team. You will try to sneak in from the rear of the enemy position and seize the immediate target for the company. The cautious company commander thought about it for a while and readily agreed to your request. You quickly returned to your team and announced the order to everyone. You think this action is extremely dangerous and the probability of failure is also very high. You allow team members to participate in this mission on a voluntary basis. However, your good intentions only brought ridicule from everyone. Even the female boss who always supports you has a bad face. The big-headed woman who took off her closed helmet was a strong woman with short white hair. She exuded a heroic charm. We Elysius are not cowards. The big-headed woman's sonorous voice won warm cheers from other soldiers. You took a deep breath and bravely admitted your mistake. You began to command the members of the team to prepare for the war. You replaced the laser gun and chose an Acateron assault shotgun with great close combat power. You asked some team members to carry a set of mortars and 3 grenade launchers, and even a laser cutter. You shamelessly snatched a large amount of ammunition supplies from the company's quartermaster. You accidentally found a hot melt bomb in the supplies, and then stuffed it into your arms with ecstasy. The next day, the sky of Taros was gloomy and night fell. The company commander once again launched a fierce feint attack in cooperation with your infiltration operation. You led the entire team, passed through the shadows between the buildings, and quietly moved to the back of the target. Your helmet constantly received a lot of data from the company, which was the enemy's position detected by the ground scanner, accompanied by the roar of war behind you. You actually arrived at the back of the building safely. Unfortunately, just as you were commanding the team members to install the laser cutter, when trying to cut through the thick wall of the building and conduct a surprise infiltration, behind your team, the soldiers responsible for the alert mission suddenly let out a series of screams. Enemy attack, a dying soldier issued a final warning. You quickly turned your sight and rushed towards the location where the sound came from. At the same time, a group of Krut hounds rushed out from the dark shadows and rushed towards you head-on. Their terrifying mouths full of sharp teeth opened to the limit and bit your head. You swung your arm and pulled the heavy trigger of the assault shotgun. A roar resounded all around from the thick muzzle, and just one shot blasted the two Krut hounds into meat paste. Don't worry about the laser cutter. Use the mortar to blow open the wall. You gave the order without looking back. Your infiltration plan is on the verge of bankruptcy, that you can only attack by force. 077, Titanium King. The best way, great. Part 3. You are listening at MaleProtagonist. Bursts of bird-like roars continue to sound around you. More than a dozen Krut carnivores with thick black feathers on their heads and dark green skin are waving their homemade double-headed sickles and rushing towards you. You are not afraid of this at all. The Akadran assault shotgun in your hand bursts out with deafening roars. Any Krut carnivores and Krut hounds who can't dodge will become your dead souls. In a short period of time, you actually relied on your own strength to firmly hold back the enemy's surprise attack. The remaining team members also used laser guns to shoot the enemy while quickly setting up mortars. They began to launch continuous bombardments on the thick walls. At this moment, the walls of the target building kept shaking and collapsing violently. Until the mortar shells carried by the entire team were exhausted, a crack large enough for humans to enter appeared in front of everyone. Grenade to clear the way, flame spray. Everyone rush in. You raised the assault shotgun with one hand and gave the order. You quickly reloaded the emptied ammunition. At this moment, a Krut flesh-eater that had only lost its arm roared and rushed in front of you. The sharp homemade sickle in the enemy's claws slashed down fiercely with the sound of wind. You didn't have time to shoot back. You swung the assault shotgun and smashed it on the opponent's beak. The Krut flesh-eater let out a painful roar. You used the carapace on the side of your shoulder to withstand a heavy blow from the homemade weapon. Then, you pointed the muzzle of the shotgun in your hand at the enemy's head and pulled the trigger. Hot, smelly flesh splatters on your carapace and helmet. You quickly glanced around, turned around and rushed into the crack of the target building. At the same time, as your team entered the target building, an explosion roared. The feint attack plan on the front battlefield changed and became a long-accumulated fierce attack. On the third day, your company completely occupied the target building. The entire Danshui factory was also completely under the control of the Airborne Corps. Only sporadic exchanges of fire occurred in some corners. One of your arms was wrapped in a circle of white bandages, and you lay in the company's camp to rest. Only 5 people are left in your 10-man team. 3 people were killed and sacrificed, and 2 were seriously injured. For the results of the assault, this is a price worth paying. Your heroic behavior won the praise of the company commander. You refused the opponent's battlefield promotion. You received a power sword that the other party had treasured for a long time from the captain, and a reply that you would share the merits with the team members. On the 4th day, the Airborne Corps that entered the rest state received bad news. Your occupation of the freshwater factory attracted the attention of the main force of the Tau Empire. A swift counterattack from the enemy is coming. Due to the restraint of the Tau Empire Air Force, the Imperial Navy cannot provide you with any support. Your 23rd Airborne Corps of Alicia can only fight alone. You found the captain as soon as possible. You think that with the current firepower configuration of the Airborne Corps, it is simply wishful thinking to want to resist the counterattack of the Tau Empire. The captain is upset about your act of stealing the power sword, and the huge pressure of the enemies approaching also makes him anxious. He kept pulling the few remaining hairs on his head and got angry at you. You were not angry, but instead made a small suggestion to the captain. Mobilize the entire Airborne Corps to dig trenches and underground passages. Use Alicia's expertise in mobile combat and rationally utilize the huge industrial zone to launch a guerrilla war with the Tau Empire. Moreover, if the freshwater factory is equally important to the Tau Empire, then they dare not destroy it wantonly. After hearing your suggestion, the company commander's anxious heart suddenly calmed down. He lowered his head and thought about it, and decided to report it immediately. The company commander took you to find the commander of the Airborne Corps, General Sekawa. You briefly repeated your suggestion to General Sekawa again. Your idea was highly praised by the other party. On the fifth day, a vigorous excavation campaign swept the entire freshwater factory. You led your team to run back and forth between the various companies, briefly repeating the way to dig trenches. However, due to the poor excavation technology and lack of excavation tools of the Elysius, the excavation of trenches and underground passages progressed slowly. You also fell into a state of anxiety. Soon after, with the help of the big-headed woman, you discovered the water supply pipeline of the freshwater factory. Those huge pipelines that were large enough to accommodate a person bending forward gave you a wonderful inspiration. You immediately ordered the soldiers to dismantle the water supply pipeline and bury it underground as an underground passage. At the same time, the excavation of some trenches also went smoothly. In the first week, your trench plan was only executed at 1/3 of its scale before it was interrupted. The counterattack force from the Tau Empire has arrived at the outskirts of the freshwater factory. One after another, the Manta APCs made by the Earth Clan engineers launched a fierce attack on the freshwater factory under the cover of a large number of combat uniform teams. The entire Airborne Corps entered the trenches, and the few Taurus assault vehicles shuttled back and forth between the factory buildings. Try to attract the Tau Empire's vanguard team into your encirclement. However, a large number of Pathfinder warriors driving Kerosene motorcycles rushed towards the Taurus assault vehicles. They tried to use more flexible speed to encircle and divide, and beams of pulse energy constantly blocked the Taurus assault vehicles' forward route. The best fighter plane was fleeting. Accompanied by General Sekawa's order, mortar shells whizzed in from the underground trenches. They fell on top of the Manta APCs. The battle suit team quickly raised their pulse rifles and cooperated with a large number of drones to fire at the unexploded shells. However, several Manta armored personnel carriers that were unable to dodge exploded, and the Fire Clan warriors on them were torn into pieces. Without waiting for more shells to be fired, the remaining Manta armored vehicles suddenly turned around and retreated to the rear of the battlefield. At this moment, a series of scorching laser gun beams shot out from the trenches and buildings, blowing up many liposuction motorcycles that were about to evacuate. You squatted in the trench and scanned the battlefield, frowning slightly and couldn't help but exhaling. Your tactics barely played a role in surprise. You think that with the trenches and underground passages, you may be able to hold out until the support of the Imperial Navy arrives. However, at this time, 20 Piranha gliders suddenly flew through the air above the freshwater factory. The pulse energy of the pulse rapid-fire cannon and the drone blew up the Taurus assault vehicle into a ball of exploding fire in the blink of an eye. Then, a number of powerful hammerhead shark gunboats also flew towards the location of the freshwater factory. The terrifying plasma artillery fire suppressed your firepower position. For the Airborne Corps that had almost no heavy weapons, it was a catastrophe. 078, Titanium King. The best way, great. 4. You are listening at novelfull.audio. In the second week, the Airborne Corps is still resisting tenaciously. With the existence of your trenches and underground passages, each company barely withstood the bombardment of the Tau Empire. The Tau Empire had to send more Kroots who were good at close combat to continuously attack the trenches and even go deep into the underground passages to fight you. Now, most of the ground buildings of the Danshui factory have been reoccupied by a team of combat uniforms. Your company launched several attacks in succession, trying to seize the position again, but always retreated due to the lack of heavy weapons. Because the company commander who led the way was seriously injured and dying, you chose to obey General Sekawa's orders and temporarily took over the command of the entire company. You ordered the tired soldiers to rotate and rest, and try to save ammunition. You began to lead some soldiers who were good at close combat to wander between the underground passages, desperately resisting the Krut's uninterrupted attacks. In the third week, you wielded your power sword with a numb expression, smashing the enemy's homemade weapons and easily cutting off his head. A lot of smelly blood splashed on your broken carapace. Because your helmet was lost in the last battle. You could only wipe the blood off your face and gasp heavily. In recent times, the Tau Empire seems to have slowed down its attack on the underground tunnel. You have been gradually surrounded and divided and have lost contact with other companies. Now, the company you lead has suffered heavy casualties, with only more than 50 people left. Although a lot of ammunition has been saved, food supplies have been consumed. Everyone can only fill their hunger by drinking water. After panting for a while, you glanced at the alien corpses under your feet and quickly retreated to the rear. You have just returned to a large excavated tunnel. A pale-faced soldier came to your side. "Captain, something is wrong." The other person whispered in your ear. "What happened? Did you encounter the Krut again?" You asked expressionlessly. The other teams had a brief communication with some Tau people who could speak the Imperial language. General Sekua was captured, and the other company soldiers have chosen to surrender. The soldier's eyes showed hesitation, and he gritted his teeth and said. You took a deep breath and fell silent. You thought for a moment and asked the soldier to notify the entire company to assemble. Soon after, the remaining soldiers gathered in front of you. You glanced at the familiar faces that were pale because of hunger. "Where is the white-headed guy?" You didn't find the familiar big-headed woman among the crowd. Report to the captain, the white-headed guy just died. A soldier who lost half of his arm raised the stump, and there seemed to be a crystal light flashing in his eyes. You sighed and threw down the power sword in your hand. You knew the current situation earlier than I did. You were silent for a while and said slowly. So, I won't stop any of you from surrendering. According to what I know about the Tau people, they also welcome you to join the greater good. You may gain more than what the human empire can give you, far better food than before, far better lifestyle than before. You will gradually despise and even hate everything in the human empire. However, this may be the price you have to pay for choosing to live. Now, those who choose to leave, please leave your weapons and ammunition to your comrades around you, and the soldiers who are willing to stay should not be impulsive. That is their personal choice. You picked up the power sword thrown aside and walked out of the alley without looking back. The soldiers who stayed behind looked at each other and maintained a strange silence. In the end, the number of soldiers who chose to stay reached 35. You order the remaining soldiers to organize the remaining equipment and prepare for the final moment. In the fourth week, you lead the malnourished soldiers out of the underground passage. However, just when you were about to face the enemy's powerful firepower, a large group of mechanical bees slowly came in front of you. You scanned the surrounding environment and did not find any Tau enemies. You raised your hand to stop the soldiers from raising their guns. Brave warriors from the human empire, put down your weapons. You don't have to fight a battle that will surely lead to your death. Even your general has surrendered to the great Tau empire. Accompanied by a strange tone of the imperial language. Countless machine bees projected a series of blue light and shadows, quickly forming a tall virtual image. It seemed to be a luxuriously dressed Tau ether, who was also the leadership of the Tau empire. You stared at the virtual image in front of you expressionlessly. As long as you surrender, join us and listen to the teachings of the greater good, you will gain the infinite goodwill of the Tau empire. Let our many races coexist peacefully and work together to make more contributions to the future of the entire universe. The gorgeously dressed ether waved the scepter in his hand. It tries to use words to disintegrate your fighting resolve and gain your submission. However, just when the other party was about to continue, you slowly raised the power sword and interrupted the other party's performance. Have you ever met the Necrons? Have you been eaten by the Great Devourer? Do you think those howling green-skinned orcs are hopeless? You stared at the tall virtual image of ether, and the tip of the power sword pointed at the other party's head. You don't even understand what the nature of the warp is. A sneer suddenly appeared at the corner of your mouth, and you said to Ether. In this cold and dark universe, weakness and ignorance have never been obstacles to survival. Arrogance is. However, your words seemed to cause great displeasure to Ether. The tall virtual image disappeared instantly. The large group of drones that surrounded you did not attack you, but flew quickly to the back. You showed a disgusted expression to the soldiers who were looking at each other in bewilderment, which caused everyone to laugh softly. At this moment, on the horizon a few kilometers away, one after another, the Tau missiles quickly took off, crossed the sky, and fell towards your position. You stared at the falling missiles and sighed helplessly. You looked solemn and straightened your back. You turned around and saluted the soldiers with calm eyes. Comrades, see you in the next life, /079, Valkyrie arrives, Valkyrie armed transport. You are listening at NovelFlow.audio. Your body was swallowed up and wrapped by the terrifying impact energy, and you turned into pitch-black charcoal again. You are dead. This simulation ended after 28 days. This simulation has a retainable option. 1. The long-inherited Ingildina-type power sword, relic, tag, I am with anger, I am with steel, I am with the mercy of angels. 2. Combat experience of the company commander of the Alicia Airborne Corps, 1 month, note, land, attack, and be surrounded. We are all little Astartes. 3. Airborne Corps Voss Valkyrie armed transport aircraft, ordinary, note, woohoo, the Valkyrie has arrived. Note, friendly reminder, her size and weight are far beyond your imagination. This simulation time has exceeded 24 hours, and the simulator loss has not been exempted. Cooling time, 28 hours. Current available cooling time, 289 hours. Does it consume the cooling time? The cooling time has not been consumed, and the simulator enters natural cooling. Cooling can be waived at any time. The simulation has just ended. Rorschach just glanced at the text on the simulator. The whole person jumped up from the desk. He clenched his fists with excitement and exclaimed. The flying vehicle is finally here. This was the first time he had simulated it so many times. Obtain a large vehicle from the human empire for the first time. Excited Rorschach rushed out of the bedroom, run towards the underground base, wait until Rorschach arrives at the base hall. The entire hall was empty, with only lights present. He glanced left and right and found no trace of Iron Man. Rorschach checked the simulator options again. His eyes passed over the power sword and combat experience with regret. He directly chose the third reward. The next second, he was in front of Rorschach. A Valkyrie armed transport aircraft painted in desert camouflage slowly emerged. Rorschach suddenly grinned. He looked around the huge machine repeatedly. Based on simple visual inspection, the entire transport aircraft is about 5 meters high. The length of the fuselage alone reaches an astonishing 19 meters. The metal wings, which look like a pair of spread wings, are also close to the same length. At the same time, a pair of huge combustion vector turbofan engines are mounted at the connection between the wings and the cabin. It makes people remember deeply at a glance. Rorschach stared at the behemoth weighing more than 10 tons in front of him. I couldn't help but laugh out loud, as a man who doesn't like big planes. Especially since this big plane belongs entirely to me. Rorschach quickly walked to the back of the cabin. After he fumbled carefully for a while, finally the rear door of the cabin was opened, accompanied by the sound of a mechanical valve turning. The huge cabin space appeared in front of Rorschach. He entered the cabin slowly. On the way to the cab, the smile on Rorschach's face never disappeared, until the excited Rorschach sat in the driving seat. After subconsciously holding the operating lever with his palm, he immediately realized a very important practical issue. Although I have ridden in the Valkyrie more than once in the simulation, however, he doesn't know how to control this flying vehicle at all. The smile on Rorschach's face froze. He sighed and took out his phone from his pocket. David? If you're not busy, please go back to the base hall. My lord? Well, you can see the problem when you come back. Rorschach stroked Valkyrie's operating lever with great nostalgia. get up and leave for now." About 10 minutes later, accompanied by a burst of melodious classical music, the figure of Iron Man David appeared at the entrance of an underground passage. Blue light flashed in its eye sockets. Almost at a glance, he saw the mechanical creation parked in the base hall and Rorschach standing aside. The melodious classical music disappeared instantly. Iron Man David quickly shook his metal body, it quickened its pace and came to Rorschach. He bowed slightly and said, "Praise be to O.M. Messiah, my lord, is this the miracle you just performed?" Luo Xia was slightly startled. He nodded awkwardly and said, "That's right, David, can you drive this thing?" Iron David raised his metal head, the blue light in his eyes stared at Rorschach and said, "My lord, do you want to hear the truth or lies?" "Truth or lies?" Rorschach blinked his eyes and asked doubtfully. Iron Man David opened his metal palm, the mechanical voice is full of sincerity. "The truth is that I was just a construction worker in the golden age of mankind. I can handle any construction problem. I have never done anything like driving a transport plane." "Where are the lies?" Rorschach took a deep breath. "I can learn, as long as I fully understand the mechanical structure of this transport aircraft. I think it is no different from today's aircraft." Iron Man David straightened his metal back slightly. Its mechanical sound seems to be brewing with pride and confidence. Hear Iron Man's answer. A smile appeared on Rorschach's lips. He raised his hand and patted Iron Man's metal arm, giving encouragement. "David, please work hard. I'm counting on you to teach me how to drive this thing. I'm going to check on Jessica first. See you later." The words were not spoken yet. Rorschach walked towards the medical room with a smile on his face. Iron Man David, who was standing there, shook his metal head. The blue light in its eye socket suddenly scattered out. He kept scanning the Valkyrie transport aircraft in front of him. "Come on, honey, let me see what's new inside you." Iron Man David murmured softly. The air in the medical room is filled with a familiar smell that only belongs to the hospital. It was a complex smell caused by the evaporation of disinfectant water and the mixing of medicines. Just on an expensive multifunctional medical bed, Jessica, who had short black hair, was lying on it wearing a hospital gown and playing with her mobile phone. Rorschach's tall figure had just entered. Jessica was in a hurry and tried to hide her phone, like a student who was caught by the class teacher playing lazy. Luo Xia, who had long noticed the other party's little tricks, couldn't help but smile. He said with a helpless expression, "Jessica, although this is an operational base, it is not a military camp with strict rules and regulations. I am not that harsh yet." And heard Rorschach's comfort. Jessica, who still had bruises on her face, smiled awkwardly. Today's Jessica is in both mental state and mood, obviously much more cheerful than before. She blinked her eyes slightly and said softly, "Boss, I just don't want to waste time." Rorschach walked to the front of the hospital bed and asked in a gentle tone, How are you recovering from your injuries?" Jessica twisted her neck from side to side. After thinking for a moment he said, "The injury is recovering, and after this serious injury, I think there is still room for me to tap into my superpowers." Rorschach was stunned for a moment, looking at Jessica repeatedly. "If it's convenient, could you tell me more about it? I know almost nothing about superpowers." "Of course, you are the boss responsible for my food, clothing, housing, and transportation." Jessica blinked. There seemed to be a hint of cunning in her eyes.